This should honestly go without saying, but this video is filled to the brim with spoilers, and so if you don't want to see any spoilers, you really shouldn't watch this video. Although, the film came out in 2008, and if you haven't seen it yet, you're pretty far behind the curve. Every so often, there comes a piece of film or literature that tells a story that captures all of us. It really makes us think, really makes us wonder about who we are, and it helps us see a lot of that in ourselves, and then as soon as the movie or the book is over, we put it down, or we turn it off, and we don't think about it anymore. Movies like this and books like this are super rare, because what they do is they slide in and out of our lives so effortlessly and seamlessly that it seems like they were never there in the first place. Books and movies like this are usually a sign of a very good story, because the content is so good and the plot is so well done that there is no break in the suspension of disbelief that we have. In comes Wall-E, the 2008 animated feature film by Pixar, made under the direction of Disney. This film is probably one of the best iterations that I've ever seen of show don't tell. It tells the story of basically an anthropomorphized trash can falling in love with a weaponized Walmart scanner named Eve, and both of them work together to help humanity realize that they need to come back from their ship called the Axiom to save the world, which they have trashed and deserted for hundreds of years. Now it's time to confess, I absolutely love this film. I think it's one of the best pieces of work that Pixar has ever put out there. That being said, it is a story, and so because it's a story, it's going to have problems and there's going to be criticism of it. Since that's the case, I want to go ahead and break down what criticism is valid, what criticism is not, and find out really if there is a problem with Wall-E. The first problem that's often brought up is that Wall-E makes fun of fat people. Yes, you read that right. There are people that think that Wall-E spends the entire movie making fun of people that are overweight. And I have an actual quote here that was posted by a website called Calorie Lab that posed the question to its readers asking, will today's overweight moviegoers spend their money to see a movie that in effect is characterizing their own bodies as the first step on the road to mankind's downfall? No, seriously, someone actually watched the entire film, wrote that down, put it to an editor, got it through, published it in an online article, and did that all without thinking critically for 10 seconds about the film they had just watched. Listen, if you watch the movie at all, you'll realize that there's a scene on the Axiom where it shows a panoramic shot of every single captain that has ever served as the head of the Axiom. And at the very beginning, the captain's skinny, and as it goes, they get progressively bigger, which is a result of them being lazy, according to the movie. At no point in the movie does the film actually vilify fat people in any way, shape, or form. In fact, at the very beginning, it vilifies the skinny people, because the skinny people, who were the leaders of the corporations, were the ones who went ahead and destroyed Earth to make a quick buck, and then got everybody onto these ships, sent them out into outer space, and put them in this position where there really is no other option than to get fat. However, I want to address the deeper issue, which is that the person who wrote this doesn't actually understand assumptions. Assumptions are really key and critical to every single storyteller. When you tell stories, you're telling them to an audience that isn't you. That being the case, there are certain assumptions and generalities that you need to make in order to tell a story to a broader audience. There's this weird conception in film now that stereotypes and generalizations are a bad thing. Think, for example, of the common knight goes into a castle, saves the damsel from distress from a fire-breathing dragon. Well, there are a couple of assumptions that you have to make. Number one, you have to make the assumption that the knight is the good guy. Number two, you have to make the assumption that the damsel in distress even wants to be saved. Number three, you have to assume that the dragon is actually guarding the princess and is going to be hyper-aggressive and try and murder the knight as soon as he sets foot in the castle grounds. If you don't make any of those assumptions, the entire story doesn't work. Assumptions, when used by good writers who employ good tactics, are used to efficiently and effectively create tension within a story when it's communicated to an entire broad audience. For example, in the case of Wall-E, if you don't make the assumption that cockroaches survive everything, then when Wall-E goes and crushes his friend underneath his treadmill that he has his legs, he becomes a murderer in the first 20 minutes of the film. I bet every single one of you made the assumption that cleaning up the Earth is a good thing, and if you didn't make that assumption, the entire return to Earth makes almost no sense. In fact, they were the ones who actually destroyed Earth in the first place. Earth might actually be healing, and that might be the first plant that comes back, and all of a sudden you get humans there that destroy the plant? Your assumption could be wrong. Or what if the humans have no good intent? Like I referenced earlier, they were the ones who destroyed the planet in the first place. If they have no good intent, they might come back there and destroy it and make it even worse, and then they all die. You operate on assumptions in order to come to the conclusion that the movie wants you to come to. Assumptions are helpful tools when they're used right. Generally, books try and avoid this as much as possible simply because they have more time to go into things. However, if you're going into a kids movie and it's an hour and a half film, it's really unrealistic for someone to expect a movie like Wall-E, which is mainly focused around cherishing other people and cherishing your surroundings, to really go into the complexities of fat shaming and societal expectations. It's a kids movie, it does its job well. I really don't think there's any water in that pitcher. Problem number 2 that people have with the film is that they think that the film promotes some sort of agenda. This is a pretty short one, but basically, what the critics here believe is that there's a certain corporation, Pixar, or more likely Disney, is trying to foist upon them a certain political agenda meant to target specifically children because this is a kids movie. Look, regardless of where you lean, it's generally accepted that recycling is a good thing for one reason or another. But besides that, this isn't an agenda being foisted on you. You need to understand something about stories. Every single story has an agenda. Every single character within a story has an agenda. Every single author, every single story writer on a film or on a TV show or on a comic book series or in a novel series, every single one has an agenda that they're attempting to communicate to the reader. When you read something, there is an agenda. And so you need to understand that there is an agenda in everything. Just because it's an agenda that you don't like doesn't mean that it's wrong. It means that you disagree with the agenda. That's the only thing. This is a love story attempting to do an action adventure. It's not an ad for the DEA. And so people really need to understand that whenever you partake in media or whenever you read a story, just because you don't like the actual narrative doesn't mean that the narrative is a problem. Narratives happen everywhere. Agendas are everywhere. It's simply for you to decipher if this is something you agree with or disagree with, and then read the story. That's it. Every single agenda you can read with, make a determination about whether or not you agree with it, and then you can go ahead and criticize it. But criticizing it for having an agenda, if that's the case, then you have to criticize CNN, you have to criticize Fox News, you have to criticize pretty much every single book or story that's ever been written. Problem number 3 that's often brought up is that Wall-E is unevenly paced and that it's boring to watch. Listen, while I love the movie, I will concede that the first 40 minutes is definitely better than the last portion of the film. Everything before they board the Axiom is pretty much gold. It's the pinnacle of show don't tell. The only things that you really hear are you hear Wall-E, you hear Eve, you hear Directive, you hear an ad playing, you hear Classified, you hear Name, and you hear Plant. Those are the only things that you hear, and everything else is driven mainly by what you can see. It is actually telling you a story without speaking at you. It's simply speaking to you, and it's, to this day, the gold standard alongside Up. Pixar has kind of a habit of setting trends in this industry. Once they board the Axiom, the movie's still hilarious, and it's still visually impressive to look at. However, one thing that I will concede is that once they board the Axiom, there are breaks in the story that don't really make a whole lot of sense. For example, when you talk about the jailbreak scene where all the malfunctioning robots break out with Wall-E to get out of that place where they're getting fixed, the movie kind of takes a break. There's a portion where it's entertaining and it's pretty funny to watch, but they take a lot of time out of the movie to set this up when they could have done it in a lot less time and gotten directly back to the plot. Another portion where they did this was when Gopher, the little red robot, takes the plant, puts it in an escape pod, and then sends it out there with Wall-E in the actual pod to be destroyed. When Wall-E's out there, he survives miraculously somehow, and then he starts using a fire hydrant to fly around the entire ship, and him and Eve do this dance where they go around the ship, and while it's visually entertaining and it makes for some pretty good laughs, it feels like there's a break in the movie. It's unevenly paced and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. However, this is much less a problem with the actual story of the second half, which is still better than pretty much any other animated movie that was coming out at the time or has come out since. It's more a testament to the brilliance of the first 40 minutes because the first 40 minutes of the film are just phenomenal. There's really not very much that stands up to it. The first 11 and a half minutes of Up are the only ones that I've seen that come even close to what Wall-E did with the first 40 minutes. The visual gags, the visual brilliance, just the storytelling in general, every single aspect of it was so good. Problem 4 that's often pointed out is that people think that Wall-E relies too much on humans being stupid and also too much on the robots having impeccable timing when it comes to the plot. In stories, there's a phrase that we use called ex machina. It's Latin and it means the machine. This is a shorter iteration of the full term deus ex machina, which in Latin means God from the machine. This phrase is used to describe events that create order from chaos, that put conveniently timed people and events in the way of the character to go ahead and save them from things like an untimely demise, simply to get the plot moving forward without having to do any work on the author and writer's part. Now keep in mind, in the storyteller's sense, they are the god of that story. You are always, at some point, organizing chaos and putting it into order. There's always going to be a government that rules how it is that your characters act, what it is that they want, and the world in which they do it. So there's always going to be some element of an ex machina in your story. However, what we're trying to avoid is certain events and people that are conveniently timed that destroy the suspension of disbelief in a story. I guess I should probably explain suspension of disbelief, shouldn't I? Basically, the suspension of disbelief is when there is an action, person, or a story that catches your attention because it's so abnormal to your normal life, but it's not abnormal enough to make you skeptical about the actual event. For example, when you watch Fast and Furious and you see someone skid, that's not that weird. You've been inside of a driver's ed class, you've seen people drift, you've seen people skid. It's abnormal enough that you would pay attention to it because you don't see it in normal traffic all that much, unless, again, you're in driver's ed. But it's not that odd to you. It's odd enough that you'll watch it, but it's not odd enough that you look at it and you're like, this actually isn't happening right now. What is odd is when you're watching a movie with Vin Diesel in it, and he's driving on the highway at over 100 miles an hour, and then he ejects himself from the actual car, gets thrown over the bridge, and then catches a woman who's being thrown from a tank going as fast as it can, and they meet at a 90-degree angle, and he grabs her without any change in direction, and he hits a car, and he goes right into the windshield, but not through the windshield, and he has no scrapes or bruises on him. At that point, your brain's going to go, I'm sorry, that's horse crap. But Wall-E doesn't ever really do a whole lot of that. Besides the robot kiss that happens at the very end that brings back his personality and memories, and the ejected from the ship, and the ship blows up, and then the plant is safe, and Wall-E's safe, and there's no scratches, there's not really a whole bunch of ex machina to go around. If you really accept the premise that Wall-E has some sort of consciousness, there's some sort of autonomy that he has, the robot kiss shouldn't really be all that far out of your purview anyway. Like I said, Wall-E is honestly a very phenomenal movie. It set the gold standard for animation, and its show don't tell is still, to this day, probably top 2, maybe 3 of the examples that I've ever seen. The first 40 minutes of Wall-E and the first 11 and a half minutes of Up are some of the best examples of show don't tell that I've seen in any film, let alone the animated category. Now sure, there are instances of plot armor, and there are instances where the story is not as well paced as it could have been. But I believe, honestly, that this is a thumbs up film. This is a film that you should go see, and this is a film that is good, objectively good, to pretty much everyone who sees it. This is something that I believe will stand the test of time even after the last 12 years. It stands the test of time, and I believe 12 years in the future, it will still stand the test of time because it has been well written, it was well thought out, and it does everything it can to deliver story over messaging. Thank you all for watching. Please like and comment below. Let me know what it is that you agreed with, what it is that you disagreed with. Let me know what your favorite portions of the movie were. And as always, I'm Jackson, and thank you for watching.